Assalamu alaikum. My name is Neemat Kabutli.
And I'm Fida Abdo. Welcome to the On Purpose podcast.
This podcast addresses pertinent issues that affect Muslim communities in Australia.
We hope that this is the beginning of many conversations.
Enjoy this episode.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to today's episode of MWA's podcast On Purpose. Today we are excited to have with us Amanda Tattersall. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So today we'll be talking about the power of community. And we have Amanda here with us, who is currently the Associate Professor of Practice at the Sydney Policy Lab at the University of Sydney. She's the founder of Sydney Alliance and getup.org.au, as well as the host of the ChangeMakers podcast. So we have a very, very interesting conversation planned today, talking about what it means to bring your whole self to being an activist. What does community organising mean? And what is the impact on it, not only for you, but for those around you? So, Amanda, we'll start off with, if you can elaborate a bit on the concept of community and what does it mean to be a community?
Oh, it's such a big question. Thank you, Fida, and thank you for having me. So for me, I mean, in part, thinking about community is thinking about having a space in public where you can feel yourself, you know. We talk about family life, which is being able to feel yourself in private, but community is a public concept where you can feel yourself amongst others in all the richness of diversity that our societies have. And that's a very, mixed and beautiful thing in a place like Australia that's incredibly multicultural. So community in a place like Sydney, for instance, where we're sitting right now, has two big elements. One is about having a sense of commonality with people who are similar to you. So, for instance, the Muslim community, or, we will talk a little bit about this later. I have a mental illness as well as doing those other things, and I feel a sense of camaraderie and connection to the community of people who also struggle with mental health. Right? So having that sort of commonality is really important. But community is also about bridging between difference. And so it's about me as a middle-class white woman building over many, many years a connection with the Muslim community in Sydney and the richness that can come from exchange and learning and understanding across diversity too.
Yeah, so, the term community organising is something that's become a lot more common recently. It probably used to be something that used to be stuck to a bit of silos, certain people who are experts in that field, but it's become something that people are using a lot more, and particularly in the Muslim community. We need to organise as a community. We are a young community, but we need to be better at community organising. What is the value in community organising? Okay,
so in some ways, community organising is a set of skills, techniques and ways of thinking and being that enact community, right? That allow us to build community. And so in some ways that's it's great strength. And it makes me so humbled and excited that phrase community organising is now widespread, because I remember when no one used it. And, I was in the United States doing my PhD and encountered community organising in this tradition built by this guy called Saul Alinsky, who'd worked in Chicago during the Depression in the 1930s and built this eventually international movement around a localised practice of how people across difference could work together to change their cities and change their world. And I put that practice in my backpack when I came back to Australia and helped build the Sydney Alliance, and now it is. You're right, it's really widespread. And it's not just the practice that I talked about that's widespread. People have interpreted community organising and applied it in lots of different ways, and that's part of its richness. But when I think of community organising, I think of a couple of key concepts. The first is relationships, right? And the power of this conversation, right? We're told that sometimes that we need to scale everything and everything needs to be big and enormous. But actually community organising says that community is built one-to-one first off. And so there's incredible power in being able to understand the dignity of every single individual and sharing between each other. But it's not just about that, right? We can have relationships in our family life that just stay there. It's also about having an understanding of power, Now, power is a concept that can freak people out, right? Because power has often been used abusively and horribly against us.
That's right.
But we say that there are two types of power, or a spectrum of power, from power over, that horrible authoritarian form of power, to power with, a creative and enabling form of power where we can actually make the world that we need. And we use relationships and we combine it with the idea of power to create that idea of power with. And power with is something that we don't just create in our community, we create it between our communities. The Muslim community can't change Australia to be an inclusive and kind place on its own. It needs to work with other communities. And so with organising, we do an analysis about thinking of what are those communities that we need to work with to be able to create the kind of power that allows us to change the world in the way that we hope it to be, where it can serve the values that we hold dear. We also talk, but even that's not enough, right? So we also talk about action, right? It's very nice for us to believe all these things, but if we can't act, if we can't enact change that actually serves our values, that creates a world that brings those values to life, it's not enough. So community organising is also about action. It's also about institutions and our organisations, right? Like us as individuals will always struggle to achieve change. You as a Muslim woman will struggle on your own, but you in Muslim Women's Australia with a network of powerful women, that makes a difference. Same with, and then you combined with the Uniting Church makes a difference. Combined with the Nurses Association, the union representing nurses makes a difference. So our institutions become an anchor for this sort of burgeoning democratic practice. And then the final really important element is evaluation. So we can do all these things, but as we do them, we're always learning. Nothing is perfect in this world. But what we can do is learn from our practice and learn from our strengths, what we've done well, and also what we can change and do better next time. And it's in that practice in that evaluation of our practice that we grow as leaders. And that's where community, made up of all of us, where we learn to become powerful citizens. And that's something that we learn over time. We're not born great leaders, we learn through our struggle.
Well, that's incredibly inspiring, right? I mean, the way you articulate that makes me think, okay, yeah, we can, right? We can do all these wonderful things. But unfortunately, reality checks in sometimes, and sometimes you can just be disheartened by things that are happening around you, or when you try and you don't see change happening. What would be your suggestions or advice maybe for trying to keep that balance between being inspired and doing all these wonderful things, but then how do you then respond when you're disheartened by what you see around you?
Yeah, it's such a good point. It makes me think of two experiences. Okay. The first is the demonstrations against the war in Iraq, right, in 2003. So I was really involved in that social movement, and it really mattered to me. My family, my dad had been conscripted to go to Vietnam and got out of it, but was an avid anti-war activist. My grandma had experienced war in England and talked constantly about it to us when we were kids. I was not supportive of that war, and was very involved. We organised the largest rally in Australia's history. There was adrenaline. It was exciting. It felt really, really powerful when 10 million people around the world protested, and then war still happened. Right, all of that effort, all of that power, and it wasn't enough. And I was really disheartened. And as I've mentioned, I have bipolar, so sometimes disheartened experiences don't just, they can hit me really hard. Yeah. And I did go into a period of depression. And the thing that eventually saw me, and it took a long time, and I guess my first piece of advice is, if things aren't going well, slow down. If we aren't, Einstein said if we keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect different results, it's the definition of insanity. And as someone who knows insanity, I think he was right. And so, at that time I did slow down. And it was actually that path that led me to go and do this PhD on coalition building and go overseas and let me define community organising. And so those experiences where things don't go well can be incredibly powerful turning points and moments for a change. But we don't feel like they necessarily are at the time. At the time, I think we feel like we're a failure.
Yeah.
And that we need to push harder and faster. And I understand that because I've lived that. Yeah. But I also think that that if we do have that capacity to step back and reflect, and look, the Muslim tradition is better than any at knowing the power of stepping back and reflection. That if we can do that, then that we can turn those hard moments into moments of transformation.
I think the value of slowing down, stepping back, is something that we all understand in our minds and our hearts, but particularly as women, we feel a pressure to keep going, right? And I need to be strong, and I can't collapse, and I can't be, seen to not be, to not just keep going. Why am I doing that? And if I want to, climb the ladder or progress, then I need to just push forward. One of the focuses of today's discussion is we want to understand what it means to bring your whole self, right, to activism, to advocacy, to empowering communities, and not leave parts of you behind, right? Because traditionally women have had to be strong, not show weakness, not show vulnerability, and in some instances be more like a man in order to lead.
Yep. In
your experiences, right, through everything that you have been doing over the years in setting up Sydney Alliance, and with your experiences with the protests, organising the protests for the Iraq War, with the unions, all of that, how have you been able to bring your whole self to the space?
It's such an important question. And I think I am the first to say I am still learning how to do this. Like I think it's incredibly important and incredibly challenging to genuinely bring your whole self to the space. Well, it's genuinely challenging for me, having a mental illness that's constantly stigmatised, that brings great judgment from others. It's hard to bring that into public. The thing that happened to me is that I had a psychosis when I was 19, and it was probably easily the most traumatic experience of my life. I was hospitalised for a couple of months. I was estranged from family and friends. It was very difficult. But it was also a turning point, right? It was a turning point because it made me choose to not be a lawyer. I was studying being a lawyer. I was studying to be a lawyer, and I finished the degree. But I made this decision that I was going to go and pursue something to do with making the world a better place, right? I was very clear on that as I got out of hospital and pulled myself back together. But the challenge is that I was able to go and pursue this more meaningful life, make social change, and I did do that. It was in the student movement and unions and throughout my career, Sydney Alliance, setting up Get Up, great things. But I did truly struggle with being able to hold together my identity as being someone who made lots of change with my identity as being someone with a mental illness. Because when I got into the student movement, I kept being attacked, like sledged, almost destroyed for the fact I had one. So if someone wanted to have an argument with me, instead of saying, "Oh, I disagree with you," they would say, "Oh, you haven't taken your medication." "Oh, you're unstable." Or not even to my face. They'd say behind my back, "Oh, Amanda's unstable." Right? And I sort of felt like I'd learned that I just can't be my whole self, right? I have to hide part of myself to be in public life. And I did for many years. And the beauty of the space that was, for me, the Sydney Alliance, building the Sydney Alliance, which had so many extraordinary leaders and brilliant organisations in it, was that I started to learn to talk about my whole self. And I remember, you're almost going to make me cry. I remember sharing a story about my experience in hospital, like almost for the first time with MAHA and the Muslim Women's Association, you know, a million years ago, 2009. I know exactly when it was. Yeah. And it was a huge turning point for me because it was this, it just felt safe enough for me to be able to say more about who I was. And, you know, I wish I could sit here and say, the Sydney Alliance fixed it all and made it perfect. It wasn't. It didn't happen like that, right? I had another psychosis and I ended up losing my job. It was a sad time. But the healing from that, even from that moment, right, that turning point, like losing your job as an adult, and I was a mum, I still am a mum, a mum of young kids, and my whole world was falling apart, trying to work out, you know, how do I hold all these things together? I slowed down rather than sped up. I mean, I couldn't speed up anymore. I just had a psychosis. Like I had to slow down. But I did slow down, and in that time, you know, I got a new job at the university, and I did some of those practical things. But I started to really look at this question of my mental health. Yeah. You know, this piece that had been missing from public life. And, you know, the Sydney Alliance who had let me go when I was sick then became an opportunity for me to change because they said that they wanted to build a relationship with me. And through the support of MAHA and the Muslim Women's Australia, a space was created where I could finally talk about what had happened to me as a whole person, as a person who had bipolar and actually, you know, struggling with my bipolar and handling and dealing with psychosis and living with it is some of the most extraordinary stuff that I've ever done. Like, setting up Get-Up's great, setting up Sydney Alliance is great. Try living with a mental illness. That is hard. Yeah. But I was able to bring that to public life at this event. Yeah. And that's, to me, walking as a whole person. Yeah. That's if social activism, community leadership at its best, that is what it allows.
I think what you've just illustrated there, Amanda, when you're talking about the whole self, and it's really, it ties in so much with our Islamic teachings of having your heart there as well. You know, you don't ever, your heart is not separate to who you are. So that whole experience for you, and, you know, I think the emotion that's coming out now, because it's, when we talk about sincerity, authenticity and activism, they're like, you know, buzzwords, but you've lived it, right? And you've had to fight in order to do that. Yeah. Right? And there are so many people who are facing these same struggles, right? And who have a million other struggles as well that they're trying to just get to.
Because also, let me just be clear, like, I have a lot of privilege, right? Yeah. I'm a white middle-class woman. I had all these university degrees. Like, I'm walking around with a lot of strengths. And sure, my mental health is incredibly challenging. But there are people who don't have those strengths. People like me need to speak with and for them. And life is hard. Like, being authentic and being real in life is hard, but we need to be if things are going to change.
Absolutely. And you mentioned before the concept of power with, right? And I think that just ties in so beautifully with the way that you then had power to share your story. And you're saying the space that opened up for you in order to do it, you know, privileged white woman, the space that opened up for you was MWA in Lakemba in Southwest Sydney.
It was MAHA. So it was extraordinary. This is the power of community, right? Yeah. This is the power of community.
Yeah. So you don't, you know, we may think that society is structured in a certain way where there are certain groups with power and others who need to, you know, rise up to that level, but it is so dynamic and so always ever changing. And you mentioned right at the beginning of this conversation the value of relationships. Can you share with us a bit about your relationship with Maha, the current CEO of MWA, and how that started? Because I think that will just illustrate what it means to be authentic, to be sincere, and when things come full circle, how every step you take in life has an impact on where you end up and who you are.
Yeah, I'd be delighted. So I was doing this project. If there are any high school students or parents of high school students, they might know the subject Society and Culture, and there's a big project you still do called a Personal Interest Project, a PIP. And I had chosen to do mine on religion. I was interested in religion. I was interested in these questions of how to make meaning in life from quite a young age. And my PIP was called Religion Through Rose-Coloured Glasses, and it was going to look at Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, right? The Abrahamic traditions. Yeah. And this was back in 1992, 1993. It was a long time ago, right? And so I didn't know any Muslim people, and so I opened up the white pages. This was the old days where there were these books that had people's addresses and names in it, and looked up Muslim. And I put my finger on the page and I rolled my finger down and found Muslim Women's Association. And I decided that they would be the people that I would call because it had women in the title. And I was like, oh, well, I feel like I could connect, you know. Yeah. So I cold called the Muslim Women's Association, and a woman picked up the phone and I booked a meeting with her. And so one day in the holidays, my mum dropped me off. She was on her way to Kingsgrove to see her parents, and she dropped me off outside the mosque, and I went into the orange brick building that sat next door, and I sat down with Maha for several hours, and I asked her all my questions, but then we just started talking. I mean, she's one of the warmest people, right? Like I've never she's just one of a kind. And it was just one of those remarkable conversations because I knew nothing and I had such ignorance, but she saw something in the conversation, a curiosity and an interest that just she was so generous with me. She gave me a tour of the mosque. She just was very generous. And then I walked off to Lakemba Station and went home. But years later, when I was building the alliance, I was just so conscious that we needed her, and that this was the moment where I had to reach out to her again. And she had never left my mind, you know, like she'd never left my mind. She's just a figure who'd been there. And so when I went, that meeting that I just described before of sharing my story, that was my next meeting with her, right? And then from that time on, we became very close. She stepped right into the leadership role in the Sydney Alliance. It was a few months later, she came to our 6-day training, our big national training. She came on the board. She became very involved. I remember the Sydney siege. When the Sydney siege happened, that was a really important moment. We worked very closely together with this project called the Olive Ribbon Project to try and stop Islamophobia, at least amongst our membership organisations. You know, there's 500,000 people in Sydney Alliance organisations. So it was a huge opportunity to be able to create a different conversation. And it was when we debriefed. We had several debriefing conversations at her house and at a friend's house. And it was at that time, I remember I asked her to be my mentor. We talked about being mentors, and I asked her to be my mentor. And she stayed with me ever since. So when I was sick, when I had my psychosis, she would call me every day, every other day to check in on me. She would talk me through things, and I'll never forget the conversation she had with me. I remember being so distraught I was feeling sorry for myself about being so sick. And it was easy to be feeling bad because it just was so hard.
Because it was bad.
It was bad. It was really bad. And she said, you have such a special brain. You see things that other people don't see. And no one had ever said that to me before. So she'll always be special for me.
That is something that I know will resonate with so many people, women of all ages. And I was sharing with you before that, you know, just through our own MWA Youth Advisory Committee, the experiences that young women are having there in understanding what it means to be in a safe space and to be vulnerable and to be yourself and not hold on.
Yeah.
And I'd like to take this to, you know, a bit of a broader level, and from your research, from your work, from your activism, what are the strengths you've gained in bringing in women of diverse backgrounds, right? Because sometimes it's easier to just keep going with who you know, right? So for you to reach out in year 12, you know, to come all the way at that time to Southwest Sydney, to Lakemba and meet up, and then for years later, then for that to be in your mind, you obviously saw value in making sure that you connected on that level. Why should people reach out?
There's a cliche, right, that we're stronger, where, you know, the different ideas are our strength. And I think that people sometimes get fooled that sameness is our sense of belonging. Like, similarity is really important. Don't get me wrong. Similarity really makes a difference. But no one's the same. No one's the same. We're all different. We've all got different brains. We've all got different faiths. We've all got different interpretations of our faith. Yeah. We've all got different skin colours. We've all got different genders. You know, like, we're just different. Fundamentally, we've all had different experiences, you know, as well as these identities. We're actually just had different experiences. And there is glory in that difference. You know, we're all different, you know. Religion speaks of it as well, that we're all different in the eyes of God, and we are all different as we walk on this earth. And that's our power. Yeah. That's our power, is to be able to harness and build on and resonate with our difference, you know. Like, it's so boring being with the same people all over again, having the same conversations all over again. When you interact, it's why people like travel. Yeah. But it's not just flippant reasons, right? It's because I think it feeds our soul. It feeds our soul we have a greater understanding of what humanity is by being able to interact with people who are different to us. You know, it's funny because the thing about bipolar is that I'm not just different to everyone, I'm different to myself, right? You know, sometimes I'm high and sometimes I'm low and sometimes I'm stable, right? I'm different to myself. And I learned from myself the power of difference, let alone from others, right? Like, it's sort of almost odd, essentialist. Like, we're always this, and it's in the difference that the learning happens, that we realise who we are as people. Yeah. But the thing is, right, is it's also about not infantilizing difference. Yeah. Right? Like, I think sometimes when people are working with communities who are different, they come in with kid gloves and are condescending, right? And I think that is that's as disrespectful as not building the relationships in the first place. The power of what I learned, I mean, it was the space that Maha created, really, but that I learned from MWA in particular was to be real, and that I wasn't there to sort of, if I tried to be condescending or pretend that I knew more, or if I was anything but just curious and open, it wouldn't have worked. Yeah. But those traits of being interested in someone else and being prepared to share, that's how we build those relationships. And there's a very clear goal, you know, you're working for the common good, as opposed to, you know, sometimes I think as the Muslim community grows here in Australia, it's become stronger in terms of saying, you know, we don't want to just be celebrated anymore. You know, like, what's the music and the food and the dress and all of these cultural celebrations that authentic and sincere engagement, I mean, it's not even on the same page as come in your cultural dress or bring your cultural food. It's working for the common good. Yeah. And when you, you know, are talking about the power of community and understanding yourself, there was something that I thought of, you know, when you said that you learn from yourself. Islamically, we've got this concept of the self. It's called the nafs, right?
and it's sometimes translated as the self or the ego. And it's a constant thing of trying to sometimes negotiate with it, or try and control it, and being aware and conscious of what is driving you. What is your purpose? Is it just I want and I need to have and I get, or is there a greater goal? Is there a greater purpose? And I think, bipolar is something on a completely different level, but I think for those from a Muslim understanding of the nafs can really just understand a little bit of what that means. Because I think sometimes when people say mental illness, those who don't understand almost just switch off and say it's beyond my capacity to even connect with you. You know, you're different, and I don't understand that. But we do have an awareness of ourselves and the different influences that we have and what drives us, right? So our awareness of the voices, right, the influences, who we are, and our purpose, it goes part and parcel with then how we engage, right? And how we choose to present ourselves to other people. So you said, before that in a space that you felt safe, you could be your whole self. But previously you felt like you had to hide that part of yourself because it was used against you. So this is not only a barrier, for someone with a mental illness, but it's a barrier for women as well. Sometimes women won't mention that they've got kids because they don't want to be seen as, they've got these other commitments, and no, they're fully invested. So what can we do as a society more broadly to be more inclusive of women from cultural and religious backgrounds, to welcome them to these spaces of community activism, community organising, and feeling like they belong, not that they're outsiders to the space.
It's such an important question. I mean, I think that there are two domains of action, right? There's what those who run those spaces can do differently, and there's strategies that those who seek to act in those spaces can do. I think for those who have existing power, I think it's important. I mean, part of it is for them to know that their lack of diversity means that there is a deficiency there, right? A room full of white men is deficient. It's deficient. Like it might be full of ego. It might be laced with money. It lacks soul. It lacks humanity, because we are more interesting than that. Yeah. We are more diverse than that. And so I think that and we can see it in politics, for instance, like the sort of empty debate that we've got. We've got an election at the moment. It's so empty. Like whichever side you think, or whatever take you have, like there's these ridiculous gotcha conversations. Yeah. There's old hashing of debates that have happened in the past. It's like we've just had COVID. Yeah. We've just had a global emergency, and we've got this fake conversation for election. Like, what is going on? It's a deficient conversation. Public life at the moment is deficient because of its lack of diversity. And I think reckoning with that for figures in public life to reckon with that is part of what needs to happen, right? Yeah. Is to link the two, that the lack of inclusion is linked to the sort of paucity of public debate. That as those two things come together, I think that there is power there. And then there's what can communities do? If there's people listening, right, and thinking, what could I do? If I'm passionate. I mean, I think there's plenty of things to do. I mean, the first thing is that change is a team sport. You can't do this stuff on your own. It's impossible. You'll burn out. And why would you want to? Because working with other people has its richness. No matter who you are, working with others, whether they're people who are similar to you or different to you, there's a richness that comes from that. We need to model the change, the diverse change that we seek in our practice. So I think finding your team is really important to be able to so find an organisation or find a group of people we've got to connect with others. And then the other one is then just standing on the shoulders of others. So the importance of mentorship, none of us are perfect, right? We're imperfect creatures. It's also true that those who have more experience have useful wisdom, right? And useful insights. And so mentorship, mentorship has been an incredibly important part of my life. Maha's been an incredibly important mentor, and I've had other professional mentors who've been incredibly important too. And those forms of stewardship, where you're supported in thinking about how to make change, is another way to make transformation relational, right?
Yeah.
Is to work and exchange with others, and you don't need to agree with each other. You can have brilliant dynamic debates, but those conversations are going to be learning conversations.
I think mentorship is something a lot of people want, and they search for it, and they may apply for a mentoring program, but then it may not result in anything. What advice would you have for young women who want to be mentored by others in this space? I mean, how do you even start?
That is such a good question. I think that's really hard. I mean, I think look around with who you already know. Yeah. The best mentors I have encountered are people who I've met and then I've connected with, and then I've sought out a further relationship. So, you might find a mentor randomly, but almost every single person I have taken on where I've been a mentor or where I've been mentored has been someone who I've already met and have already sort of tested the relationship. It's almost theological, right? There's lots of testing and trialing of leaders in the Abrahamic tradition, right? Lots of testing and trialing of leaders, and there's a good lesson in that, right? Like, you might not find the right person in the first instance, and so I think exploring your network is a really important part. And then then if that's too narrow, asking people but I do think it's mentor, to find a mentor is to find a fairly intimate relationship, and so using a sort of relational chain rather than the web is probably going to be more useful. That said, I found my mentor in the white pages, right? So I do think that those sort of relational connections are probably the most powerful.
So again, it comes to relationships, and I think this is just an amazing. It just keeps coming back to relationships. We're talking about the power of community, and then we keep coming back to people knowing each other, and I think essentially that's really what it is, right? Yeah. So for people who are listening, for people who want to make a difference, and let's say addressing specifically other young Muslim women, right, who feel that if they walk into certain spaces, they're going to be judged, and you have an understanding of that because of your mental illness, right? So I think you can speak to that. How do you cope with that? Or how did you still persevere when people were saying, oh yeah, don't listen to Amanda, she hasn't taken her meds? How did you keep going?
I think, look, I think that I do have a sense of, but I also think there's a difference, right? I could hide my illness. There's no hiding being a Muslim woman. Yeah. Well, there's often no hiding, if you want to be authentic. Wearing the hijab means that you're going to be seen. And so that, potentially it's different. So, I wouldn't want to speak to knowing. It took quite a lot of time. I mean, I think when I was younger, I just tried to pretend it wasn't happening somewhat, and just tried to sort of push it away and just ignore it. I'm fine type of attitude. Yeah. And that did work for a bit, but it wasn't very sustainable. Like that sort of more of a prideful, it shouldn't affect me, so it won't affect me. It did affect me.
As if that's going to work.
It did affect me, and it was horrible. And I was so angry about it because the consequence at that time was that I just tried to be 10 times better than everyone else. Like I just would work so much harder. I didn't have breaks. I would work over the weekends because I felt like I just had to prove that I could be normal, right? So there was a sort of self-destructiveness to not confronting the reality of what how it impacted me. I couldn't really do that after I had the second psychosis and I lost my job and so forth. And I think that that's why I decided to speak more publicly, because it became this thing of, well, if I speak about it, then you can't attack me over it because I'm owning who I am. And say whatever you want. Yeah. This is me. The whispers, you can whisper, I can speak.
Yeah.
And so that has been my way through. And, you know, now I speak more and more. And I know that still it makes some people uncomfortable. I know that I still get past, you know, people saying negative things. And it still hurts. But I feel like I have a more ownership over my own story by the fact that I've chosen to speak about it. I'm setting my own story rather than having it set by someone else.
Yeah, and we talk about a lot in our in our area of work where we're working with women. We talk about owning your strengths, and I think what you've shared with us today has shown what that looks like. And owning your strengths often means being vulnerable. Right? As we sort of wrap up the conversation, I do just want to talk about vulnerability, right? Was it hard for you to be vulnerable and speak about your story? Or was it something that it happened and it was just an easy thing for you to do?
It was incredibly hard. Not long after I spoke with Maha, I remember we had a conference and there was a woman there who's clearly sick, like I was, and it was like a post-traumatic stress experience, and that was more like what it was like. I would just cry, like I couldn't actually talk about how psychosis happened or what happened in hospital without tears. I couldn't even form words, and the thing that the thing that enabled me to talk about it, and we're talking about like over 6 years, so it's a very long time, was slowly, like with Maha and others, talking about bits of my story in conversation where I felt safe. I would tell a little bit of my story, and then I'd tell it didn't go well every time. Sometimes I'd tell my story and someone would ask something that was horrible, right? And I would retreat and feel terrible. But then I would steel myself and I'd come back and then I would I remember telling my story more at an event. Like, it was very, very slowly finding the words. And so I guess there's a lesson in that, right? Being vulnerable isn't about pouring our heart out at the first opportunity. There's a phrase that one of my colleagues used to say, which is that you don't wear your pearls every day, right, in relation to stories. And I think it's true. Like, it's not like you go into a random room and tell everyone, like that I tell everyone, and I have bipolar and it's so great. Like, no. You don't need to share that story every day. And it will take time for you to work out how to tell it in a way that allows you to feel safe. I used to say that I was sick for years. Okay. I got sick when I was 19. It was life-threatening and it changed my direction, and that's why I got involved in social change. And that was my story, and then eventually it became more open. And I think there's a lesson in that you've got to share what you... when we're talking about public life, not private life. In private life, you are much more open and vulnerable. In public life, it's a trickier space, and you have to have the not the confidence is the wrong word, but you have to feel, maybe it's ego enough. What you're saying, this sense of self that it's going to be okay to talk, that you've got enough support around you, that you've got the words to speak it, that you've reconciled it in your mind as well, that this is a story you can tell. And that can take a long time.
Yeah, I think that is such an important thing to understand, because, you know, what we often see is when a person realises that they can be their true selves, it's almost like they want to rush into that, you know, and then may share too much somewhere in a space that wasn't appropriate, and then we'll just go back and it'll have a really, really adverse effect. So the process, slowing down, I mean, it applies with absolutely everything, doesn't it? Right? So when we're talking about empowering ourselves, empowering community, relationships, it all requires understanding the why, you know, talking to yourself, understanding yourself, and like you mentioned, having the right people around you, right, that you can lean back on and know that they will support you. And I think, you know, what you've shared with us today has been so not only incredibly inspiring, just, you know, as a sort of ideas and notions, but just in practice as well. And I do really, really hope and believe that people will hear your story. The more people hear your story and connect with it, the more people will feel confident enough to share who they are and their true selves. And, you know, ultimately we don't have to pretend, right? We don't have to pretend to be someone else, someone who we're not, because essentially we're harming ourselves if we do that. Yeah. So thank you so much, Amanda, for being with us here today, for really bringing light to what it means to bring your whole self to community advocacy and activism and organising from a perspective, I think, that really needs to be amplified a lot more. And I hope today's conversation will serve as that. And, you know, the work that you're doing in all of the spaces that you're doing, I think, is just absolutely incredible. And, you know, we thank you as well for everything that you do and continue to do. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciated the conversation.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.